Lately, it feels like there are just so many questions in the air, right, about where we're headed as a society.
Definitely. A sense of unease, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Are things fundamentally changing? Is control getting, I don't know, tighter?
Well, that's what we're diving into today.
Right. This deep dive tackles that feeling. We're looking at this idea, which comes up in some of our source material, that maybe American Western civilization is drifting towards something called authoritarianism.
And authoritarianism, basically, it's about concentrated power. It often means, less freedom for individuals, weaker democratic checks and balances.
Or less safe for ordinary people in how things are run.
Precisely. And what's interesting, or maybe concerning, is how relevant that term feels in global discussions right now.
It really does. So we've pulled together various sources, articles, research pieces to really get into the factors and the history that these materials point to.
Trying to understand what might be feeding into this potential shift.
Our goal here is to give you a clear picture, cut through the noise, deliver the key insights without getting bogged down. You're looking for understanding, fast but thorough.
And that's what we aim for.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Does the U.S. have, historical roots that might explain any leanings towards this sort of thing?
That's really the place to start. And yeah, these tensions aren't brand new. Think back to the very founding.
The Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists.
Exactly. You had the Federalists pushing for a strong, centralized government. They thought that was essential for stability.
But the Anti-Federalists were really worried about that.
Deeply worried. They were focused on individual liberties, states' rights. They feared that central power could become tyranny.
So that argument, that push and pull between central control and individual freedom, it was baked in from day one.
Pretty much. It set up this fundamental tension that, keeps reappearing throughout American history.
Okay, so that's the foundation. What about later moments, like the Civil War? That seems like a major test.
A huge test. And look at Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, the right to challenge your imprisonment in court.
That was a massive move, taking away a fundamental right.
It was. And the justification was national survival, right? Preserving the Union during an existential crisis.
But it shows how, in extreme circumstances, perceived necessity can override individual liberties.
Absolutely. And it sparked, furious debates about executive power, about the balance between the federal government and the states. Debates we're still having in different forms.
It feels like those arguments never fully go away. They just change shape.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, fast forward again. What about the Red Scare in the 1950s? That feels relevant, too.
Oh, definitely. Fear again, right. This time, the fear of communism, and it led to some pretty authoritarian actions.
McCarthyism, blacklists, people's lives ruined based on suspicion.
All in the name of national security. It's a stark example of how fear, especially fear of an other, an external or internal enemy, can make a democracy turn on its own principles.
Undermining due process, freedom of association, freedom of speech?
Exactly. The focus became hunting down perceived threats, even if it meant trampling on core rights. It shows how fear, if it gets out of hand, can lead democracies down a dangerous path.
So these historical moments, they illustrate this recurring conflict between, let's say, effective governance or security and individual liberty.
It's a constant balancing act, and sometimes the scales tip dramatically.
Okay. Now, our sources really zero in on populism and political polarization as maybe speeding things up today. Let's get into that.
Yeah, the rise of populism is a really key factor discussed in the material. We see leaders emerging, claiming they represent the real people against some corrupt elite.
And that message can be powerful, right? It resonates with people who feel left behind or ignored.
Very powerful. And it's not just one side of the aisle. You see this rhetoric across the political spectrum at different levels of government.
But the sources also point out a danger in how populism often works.
Yeah.
It tends to simplify really complex problems.
That's the critique, yeah. It offers easy answers, clear enemies, which can be appealing, but it often flattens the nuances needed for good policy and healthy democratic debate.
And that links directly to polarization, doesn't it?
Absolutely. When society gets really divided, really polarized, it creates this environment where everything feels like a battle.
Us versus them, no middle ground.
Right. Different opinions aren't just disagreements anymore. They're framed as threats to your way of life, to the nation itself. Compromise becomes almost impossible.
So how does that kind of atmosphere open the door to more authoritarian approaches?
Well, in that supercharged, polarized environment, with populist leaders simplifying things and demonizing opponents,
People might start wanting just a strong leader to cut through it all.
that's the potential risk highlighted. Democratic processes, deliberation, compromise, respecting minority rights, they can start to look slow, messy, ineffective, maybe even like part of the problem.
So a leader who says, I alone can fix it, might sound appealing.
Potentially. Especially if that leader claims to speak directly for the people. They might feel justified in bending or breaking democratic rules and norms to get things done.
And if trust in institutions like Congress, the courts, the media is already low.
Exactly. That erosion of trust combined with extreme rhetoric can make people more willing to accept or even demand more authoritarian solutions just to feel like something is being done.
It's a concerning feedback loop. Okay, another huge piece of this puzzle, according to the sources, the media and the spread of, well, bad information.
Yeah, the media landscape shift is massive, especially with social media. It's completely changed how we get information, how we talk about politics.
And the problem isn't just the speed, it's the quality of information.
Right.
Disinformation.
Right. Disinformation, stuff that's deliberately false or biased, designed to mislead. It's become a powerful tool for shaping public opinion, often in ways people don't even realize.
And social media platforms seem almost designed to spread it quickly. Plus, you get trapped in bubbles.
Those echo chambers are a real issue. If you're only seeing news and opinions that confirm what you already believe,
You never get challenged. It reinforces your viewpoint and makes the other side seem even more alien or wrong.
and it makes critical thinking harder. Plus, the algorithms often promote sensational stuff, right? Things that get strong emotional reactions.
Yeah, outrage clicks, fear clicks.
And that often means that misleading or outright false narratives get amplified because they generate engagement. It can create this distorted picture of reality for people.
So you end up with this constant sense of crisis, maybe manufactured urgency.
That's a potential outcome. And that feeling of constant threat or chaos can, again, feed that desire for a strong leader to impose order, even if it means sacrificing some democratic values.
It really highlights how important media literacy is, being able to sort fact from fiction.
Absolutely critical. We need the tools to navigate this landscape, to question what we see, and protect ourselves and our democratic processes from manipulation.
Okay, let's talk about something really fundamental that the sources flag: the possible erosion of civil liberties and democratic norms.
This is crucial. When we talk about a shift towards authoritarianism, it often involves the gradual chipping away of basic rights and established democratic practices.
And it's often done under the banner of something else, like security.
Very often, national security is a common justification. Think about the USA Patriot Act after 9/11.
Right, that dramatically expanded government surveillance powers, the NSA stuff.
Huge expansions. And it sparked, and continues to spark, intense debate about that trade-off. Security versus privacy. Where do you draw the line?
And that debate is still very much alive.
It is. And we also see challenges around freedom of speech, particularly online, laws trying to tackle misinformation or hate speech.
Which sound good in theory.
But the worry sometimes is that they could be used to silence legitimate dissent or unpopular opinions. Defining things like hate speech or misinformation can be really tricky.
And the courts often end up being the referees there.
They do. Then you also have examples mentioned in the sources, like how whistleblowers or certain types of activists are treated.
Creating a chilling effect, making others afraid to speak out.
That's the concern. If people see others facing harsh consequences for challenging authority, they might just stay quiet.
So it's not always one big dramatic event, but maybe a series of smaller changes that add up.
Exactly. An accumulation of erosions that, taken together, can really weaken the foundations of democracy. It underscores why advocating for individual rights has to be constant.
It really does feel like a death by a thousand cuts scenario sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The sources also connect economic factors, especially inequality, to this whole trajectory.
Yes, the economic dimension is considered really important. You can't really separate politics from economics.
So the argument is that a widening wealth gap and economic insecurity make society more vulnerable.
That's the core idea. When you have growing inequality where a small group holds a huge amount of wealth, while many people struggle with stagnant wages or precarious jobs.
It breeds resentment, frustration.
Absolutely, it creates discontent. And people feeling economically insecure or left behind might be more open to radical voices, including authoritarian ones, that promise easy fixes and someone to blame.
So economic pain makes people desperate for solutions, maybe any solution.
It can, if the current system feels broken. If democratic processes seem too slow or rigged in favor of the elites, then a strong leader promising decisive action, even if it bypasses democratic norms, might look attractive.
Trading freedom for perceived stability or economic benefit.
That's the potential danger zone. Plus, deep inequality feeds that us versus them thinking we talked about. It can fracture society, make people suspicious of each other, and concentrate political power alongside economic power.
So immediate economic worries might overshadow longer-term concerns about democratic health.
That's a real risk. When you're worried about paying the bills, abstract principles might seem less urgent.
That makes a lot of sense.
Well,
Now, what about culture? The sources talk about cultural shifts and national identity playing a role, too.
yeah, the cultural dynamics are really complex right now. You have the rise of identity politics, for example.
Which means groups organizing around shared identities, race, gender, religion, etc., to advocate for their interests.
Right. And while that can be crucial for giving voice to marginalized groups and promoting equality, it can also create tension.
How so?
Well, sometimes the assertion of different group identities can clash with older, more traditional ideas of what it means to be, say, American. It can fuel anxieties about cultural change.
And immigration fits into this, too, presumably. Increasing diversity, changing the face of the nation.
Exactly. Increased immigration brings undeniable benefits and dynamism, but it can also trigger resistance from those who feel their traditional culture or national identity is under threat.
And that feeling of threat can make people support leaders who promise to protect that identity, maybe through more authoritarian means.
That's a connection the sources explore. Calls for stricter border control, cultural preservation. Sometimes these can mask or lead to support for less democratic measures.
And the conversations around race and identity are so polarized now.
Extremely. On one hand, there's greater awareness of historical injustices and ongoing inequalities. On the other, there's sometimes a backlash against those conversations, a feeling of being attacked or blamed.
And that polarization itself can be exploited.
It can create an environment where strong, even authoritarian, responses that promise to restore order or defend a particular group's status seem appealing to some. It's a really volatile mix.
It really is. Okay, so we painted a picture of historical tensions, populism, polarization, media issues, economic stress, cultural clashes. It sounds pretty bleak, but the sources don't stop there, right? They also talk about resistance.
Absolutely. Resistance is presented as a crucial counterweight. History is full of examples of movements pushing back against authoritarian trends and fighting for democracy.
And we see that today.
Definitely. The sources point to contemporary movements focusing on things like racial justice.
Like Black Lives Matter,
Exactly. And women's rights.
the women's marches.
Right. Environmental protection, economic fairness movements. These groups often arise specifically because they perceive threats to rights or democratic norms.
And then they mobilize people.
They'll mobilize communities, raise awareness, put pressure on institutions, and advocate for policy changes. They aim to amplify marginalized voices, challenge inequalities, and hold power accountable.
And they're often pretty savvy with using technology, social media.
Very much so. Using digital tools for organizing, spreading their message, coordinating action, it's a key part of modern activism.
But it's not easy for them, is it? They face pushback.
Oh, significant challenges. Political backlash, attempts to discredit them with misinformation, sometimes internal disagreements or burnout. It's tough work.
But the sources suggest they're still vital.
Absolute vital. Their resilience, their ability to adapt and keep pushing is seen as having the potential to reshape the conversation and reinforce democratic values. They remind us democracy needs constant work, constant engagement.
So looking ahead then, the sources seem to suggest it's not predetermined. There are different possible futures.
Right, it's presented more as a crossroads. There's a pessimistic path outlined.
More government overreach, fewer freedoms, maybe a society kind of paralyzed by fear or apathy.
Something like that. A continued slide where democratic norms are weakened and control gets more centralized. But there's also an optimistic path.
What did that look like?
It involves a strong democratic response, grassroots movements staying active, high levels of civic engagement, people getting involved, demanding accountability.
And education plays a big role there.
Huge. Fostering critical thinking, teaching democratic principles, encouraging people to be active citizens, not just passive consumers of politics.
And using technology for good, to connect people, promote transparency.
Exactly, using tech to empower, not just distract or divide.
So what can people actually do? What kinds of actions contribute to that optimistic path?
Well, the sources talk about things like enhancing civic engagement, getting involved locally, paying attention to policy, contacting representatives.
That anyone can do, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the community level, supporting initiatives that teach democratic values, promoting media literacy, and crucially, fostering dialogue.
Talking to people you disagree with.
Trying to, yeah. Building bridges, finding common ground, or at least understanding different perspective, building a collective sense that democracy, despite its flaws, is worth protecting.
So it really boils down to not checking out, staying involved, staying informed, talking to each other.
That seems to be the core message. Active engagement is framed as the antidote, the way to steer away from potential authoritarianism towards a better, more democratic future.
Wow. Okay. This has been, well, a really deep and, frankly, sometimes sobering look at these issues based on the sources we examined.
It's definitely complex. There are no easy answers here.
No, but hopefully this overview hitting the history, the current pressures like populism and media, the economic and cultural factors, and also the resistance and potential paths forward, hopefully it gives you, the listener, a clearer framework for thinking about it all.
Understanding the different pieces and how they might connect.
Exactly. So maybe something to think about as you go about your day. Where do you see these tensions playing out, even subtly, in your own community or conversations? What does safeguarding democracy actually look like in practice for you?
A really important question to keep asking.